Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our School for CEOs webinar in support of Women in Leadership. We're delighted to welcome guest speaker Rachel Short, Director at Why Women Work. Rachel is an active campaigner for women in corporate leadership and is going to be sharing some insights from our latest research on the 30% Club on on managing men and women throughout the executive pipeline. Executive pipeline development is a core part of our business here at School for CEOs. And before I pass you over to Rachel, I'd like to introduce you to our Dimensions framework, which really encapsulates the essence of our leadership program and ties neatly in with some of the findings that Rachel will show us shortly. Bear with me one second.
The School for CEOs Dimensions uses insights that have proven invaluable in understanding the realities of business life at a senior level. Made up of multiple dimensions, the framework forms an integral part of our leadership programs. It underpins the behaviors and attributes an individual needs to succeed as a leader in their business. Managing up. Form the right relationship with your boss and other stakeholders. Managing down. Lead both your immediate team and the wider organization. Managing out. Work with stakeholders outside your organization. Managing in. Keep your feet on the ground. Managing across. Get your peer relationships right. If you want to step up to the next level, call 0131 225 5886 or email info@schoolforceos.com.
Great. I'd now like to pass you over to Rachel, who is here with me to talk a little bit more about what is the 30% Club and the implications of their latest research. So Rachel, thank you for joining me, and here you go.
Thank you, Catherine. Hello, everybody on the webinar today. I'm really looking forward to sharing these findings with you. I'm hoping we've got a real diversity of audience on this webinar. Some people who are already managing people, some people who are being managed, and some people who are responsible for the quality of people management in the organisation in which you all work. So without further ado, the structure of what I'm about to share with you really is quite simple. Talk a little bit about the 30% Club. I'll talk a bit about where the ideas and the methodology for the research came from. I'll talk a little bit about the findings in terms of the quality of management, the quality of people development, and the promotability of men and women. And then I will wrap up with some practical so what's, and then we'll be opening the line for questions and answers. And hopefully you'll be able to enter some of your questions into the chat box on the webinar, or raise your hand, or just talk. We'll open up the lines at the end. So without further ado, I'll kick off. For those of you who don't know the 30% Club, and some of you may already be part of a participating organisation, we are a campaign. It's a voluntary, business-led campaign. We work alongside a number of supportive partners, such as the Hampton Alexander Review, which was set up by the UK government, but a whole range of other campaigners for more gender diversity in corporate leadership. And the 30% Club was set up originally in 2010, and that was in response to the financial crisis and the requirement really for more for better corporate governance, and the research at the time which suggested that if you had greater diversity in general, but gender diversity particularly, you are more likely to see a slightly different type of corporate governance coming out of large corporate boardrooms. So the original targets for the 30% Club were to achieve 30% of FTSE 100 directorship positions being held by women by 2015. We got pretty close to that with 27%. The targets of the 30% Club are all 2020 targets, and we have extended and expanded. So we are now looking to achieve 30% of boardroom directorship roles being occupied by women across the FTSE 350. We are also internationalizing. We already have 8 chapters in some of the G20 countries, and we're looking to have 20 chapters one in each of the G20 countries. We have also expanded our horizons to look at not only the boardroom roles, but senior management positions, and we're aiming to get 30% of senior management ranks populated by women by 2020 in the FTSE 100. The reason it's a 30% club and not a 50% club is because that 30% has been shown to be a tipping point in social psychology between majority and minority groups. So once a minority group achieves a 30% demographic, then it starts to be able to influence and shape the mainstream, the majority group, and becomes part of that sort of change dynamic. So I talked about 2010 when corporate governance was really one of the main aims. I'm not going to sell gender diversity as a concept or provide a business case for you. I'm already anticipating if you're on this webinar or interested in this webinar, you will already be bought in to the business case for diversity and gender diversity in particular. But what I will say is if you look out into the very volatile and uncertain world in 2017, with some of the geopolitical instability, some of the mass migration that's been going on across Africa and Europe, Middle East, some of the isolationist threats to global trade in particular, and some of the shifts around borders, then I think it would be hard not to understand that innovation, agility, productivity are all really going to be key for those organisations that succeed in that very volatile and uncertain environment. So I will move on swiftly from the 30% Club to just talking a little bit about how we came up with this idea and what we did, and then go and talk about the findings. So why line managers? Why look at what line managers? I suppose there were 2 main drivers behind this piece of research. First one was we've done a lot of work talking to and with chairmen and CEOs and senior leaders in large organisations, and it was clear that they were bought in, signed up, really wanted to change things in their organisations. They were struggling with the speed of change, and there were signs that there was some gender fatigue, there was some change fatigue actually around the whole diversity agenda. That was one reason. And a lot of the barriers to change were being described as happening lower down in the organisation. The second reason we were looking at the impact of line managers on that inclusive, diverse corporate environment was as a result of some of the research that the 30% Club conducted in 2014 that showed there were rather different quality of arrangements going on between some of those high-flying female leaders and their much more frequent male leaders. And what we found there was that some of those successful senior female leaders had already negotiated and come to arrangements with their line managers around how they could work in an agile way, which didn't necessarily mean that they were signed up to some formal, flexible or agile working policy. What they had was a one-on-one arrangement that they had discussed, shared and agreed with their boss, with their line manager, which involved them not working in a less committed or less effective way, but that they were given a bit more scope and autonomy to arrange that themselves. Unfortunately, although these arrangements worked very well for the line manager and for the individual direct report, they were rarely broadcast more publicly in the organisation, and people working for that senior female leader or working around that senior female leader may not have really realised quite the extent of blended working that was going on. So we wanted to see what was happening, what was really going on across the pipeline, and what we picked was a cross-representative section of managers and direct reports from 10 of the 30% Club participating organisations. These organisations came from 7 different sectors, very broad range of people, and went from executive committee all the way down to very junior managers. The only criterion for participating in this research was that you had to be a line manager with at least one male and one female direct report. And what we ended up with was a really nice data set. The methodology was interviews, so very short, structured interviews carried out by people in the organisation, and then transcribed, recorded and transcribed and anonymised and sent over to the research team at 30% Club for analysis, which is where I came in. So I'd just like you to take a few seconds out at this point and reflect on who you think has been your best manager in your career to date. Just stop and have a think about them and what they did, how they operated, how they behaved towards you, and the impact it had on you. You don't need to type anything into the chat box at this point. Just hold that manager, that individual in your head. I mean, what we tend to hear in response to that question is, what made them the best manager? It's something to do with the quality of the relationship they had with you. It's to do with the amount of stretch and growth opportunity they gave you. It's usually to do with personal connection you had with them. Usually the support they gave you as well through a difficult career or a difficult life transition. And something about their empathy, their understanding of you as an individual, and their ability to adapt and shape worked with you. These are all very classic textbook responses from an Human Resources Manual around what makes for a great people manager. I'm a psychologist, and I come at this from a slightly different angle, which is more of a psychodynamic angle. And actually, what this type of response suggests to me is that your line manager is providing two different sorts of psychological support for their direct reports. One is they're creating a secure base. That's a psychological base from which the direct report can go out and explore the world, can experiment, can try new things, can really take new directions, innovate, and do that very confidently. And then the other psychological base is the safe haven, and that's actually having gone out and tried something. If it's failed or you've encountered a setback or a challenge, you can come back to that safe haven, and your line manager will explore that with you, will reassure you, will allow you to take learning from that failure or setback rather than criticism and a closing down of any attempt to try anything new going forward. So I'm going to move on a little bit. Obviously, not all of the line managers who took part of this research were those idealized, perfect people managers, as you're going to find out. I'm going to give you the three sort of very top headlines around how they manage, how they develop, and how they see their direct reports as promotable. And then we'll come on to the so what's for you. First results then on managing. We had 7 questions in the very short structured interview. First question was a simple calming one, just to position the person into the interview, get them grounded in the conversation, which was how long have you managed or been managed by this person? What we found here, and I don't think there'll be any surprises for any of you who've been looking at this demography of your organisations, is that at the senior levels, the women were in those relationships for much longer, significantly longer period than their male counterparts. So at the very top, senior female direct reports had been managed by their manager for 3.6 years, whereas their male peers only just over 3 years, 3.1 years. And what we also found, second question was not how long have you been managed by, but how much time on average do you spend in direct contact with? And again, if you looked hierarchically at the organizational management trios, at the very top end of the structures, you found at ExCo, at senior management level, i.e. business or function head level, that managers and their direct reports spent between 2.5% and 5% of their time together. Very, very little time, actually, if you think about it at executive committee level. Probably most of that time was sat in an executive committee meeting. Whereas at the bottom end of the organizational hierarchy, junior managers were spending between 25 and 30% of their time with their direct reports, so much closer, much more opportunity to observe and work with their direct reports on a day-to-day basis. The third and the fourth questions were, again, very simple rating scales. So we're still working with quantitative data here. And on a 0 to 10 scale, we asked how competent, how good at their job is your manager or your direct report? And then the second question, how easy are they to work with? And what you see on the screen in front of you is an average from the responses to those two questions. So what you have here are questions that are tapping into respect and trust. The competence one is tapping into respect, and the ease of working one is tapping into trust. And what you can see here is that female direct reports of female line managers give the most positive ratings on those rating scale questions. The question about how much time direct contact, actually, it was female direct reports of female line managers who felt they got a really good slice of the pie on the time spent with their boss. They said 20% on average. The male direct reports, as you can see, of the female line managers are relatively critical of their female boss. They give the lowest score, 7.1 on average. And they felt they had a pretty average amount of time with their boss, so 13 to 15% is what just about everybody else said they spent in terms of average amount of time. Apart from the female direct reports of male bosses, they said they only got about 8% of their boss's time, but it didn't affect their perceptions of competence and ease of working with their boss. So when we looked at the qualitative responses to the next three questions about how the line manager got the best out of the individual, how they developed them, and how they saw them as being promotable, then we could actually link what was said about the line manager with these ratings. And what came out really clearly in terms of that positive female-to-female management relationship rating was it was to do with the quality of the relationship, it was to do with the level of insight, the level of individual attention, the level of time and commitment that was given by the female line manager to the female direct report. And interestingly, it was exactly or very similar behaviours from the female line manager that were seen as slightly intrusive and overbearing and maybe micromanaging by her male direct report. We didn't see quite the same thing when it came to looking at the female direct report's experience of being managed by their male boss. What we found there was that the female direct reports described their male boss as quite busy and difficult to interrupt, or they didn't like interrupting them. And so most of their interactions with their male boss were in those formal meetings rather than the informal ad hoc chats, phone calls, just dropping into the office or catching in the cafe or at the water cooler, whatever it may be. That's all I'm going to say about managing at this point. Come on, talk a little bit more about that perhaps in some of the Q&A towards the end. I'm going to move on and talk about development. Again, I'm going to ask you to take a moment just to have a think about what has been the most useful piece of developmental input that you've had in the course of your career, and maybe a really long, big investment in a management program or an MBA or something like that. It may just be a really helpful conversation that you had with somebody at a pivotal point in your career. I don't know. When we asked the question in our interviews, which was, what does your manager do that develops you in your current role or for future opportunities, and how, or if you're asking the managers, what do you do to develop your direct reports in their current role for future opportunities? The thing that came out most consistently across the board was feedback. And of course, it wasn't just any old feedback, it was a certain quality and quantity and timing of feedback. But what came out really loudly and clearly here was that the female direct reports, what they particularly valued was feedback that was both challenging and candid. And it was really clear that they described that type of feedback as being very positive, very helpful, really useful for them. So we didn't get any hint in this research that women were becoming emotional in response to some quite tough feedback conversations. The other thing that was interesting was both female direct reports and female line managers mentioned feedback in the context of mutual feedback, so an exchange of feedback between the manager and the direct report. And it seemed that that was happening more frequently, certainly from this research, between women in an organisational context. What we found, though, was some clear gender differences on the focus of that feedback, and by that I mean the content of the feedback. So what we found was that women were being given advice or feedback on how they were doing things, and that was by a 5-to-1 ratio. And that feedback on how was tending to be directed towards addressing a perceived area of weakness, broadening their experience or balancing out something that they were currently doing already. It was also, if they had a male line manager, quite often feedback gathered from third parties, which was trying to help them change their perceptions about what they were doing and adapt their behaviour accordingly. And also from a male line manager to a female direct report, more likely to be about working on their relationship or interpersonal style, adapting it quite often along fairly stereotypical lines when it comes to thinking about gendered behaviours, to be more assertive or to be more directive in the way that they were engaging with their colleagues. The men, on the other hand, the male direct reports, they were being given feedback about what they were doing, not how they were doing. So what they were doing, they were usually being given feedback about building on an area of strength, deepening their experience or deepening their area of expertise. And that was usually towards achieving a quantifiable, very tangible attainment, be it a qualification or some sort of description of something that they could use on their CV to help them move their careers forward. So quite different aims and objectives in the way that feedback was being experienced by those male and female direct reports. I'll come back to development, other types of development differences in the Q&A if anyone's interested as well. But I'm going to move on and talk about promotability. And the question we asked here was a deliberately difficult question. It was difficult in two ways. It meant that the person responding, be it a manager or a direct report, had to visualize a future hypothetical situation, and they also had to put themselves in the shoes of somebody else to answer the question. So the question was, this is the penultimate question, if you were promoted into your line manager's role, bearing in mind these are all direct reporting relationships, so there's no span breaking here, how might you do their job, or how might you operate differently from your line manager? That was the upward asked question. But if you're asking, we asked the line managers, if your male or female direct report were promoted into your role, how might they operate differently from you? And what we found was a very clear pattern of difference along gendered lines between male and female line managers. The male line managers really found it more difficult to answer this question than the female line managers. And the first thing we noticed when we looked at the transcripts was a gap in the timing and how the male line managers answered this question. Their first response would be either a silence while they thought, or they would fill that silence with, that's an interesting question, or that's a difficult question, or I don't know, let me take a bit of time to think about that, or oh, that's interesting. And then they would think, and then they would come back with some responses, but again, they would generally be gendered responses. And you've got the stats around the gender split in the research overview, which is also available on the School for CEOs website. So I encourage you to have a look at that. You'll get all the questions on the back of it, and you'll see the gendered findings. What happened here was that the male line managers would say, I think, rather than responding on the point of difference, I think they would do things very similarly to the way that I'm currently doing them. So they would talk about the areas of overlap and similarity. And the reasons they would give for describing those areas of overlap or similarity were either that they had seen their direct report deputised for them, or they'd had feedback about how their report deputised for them, or they already could envisage areas of personality similarity or character similarity or operational experience that was similar. Or they'd already set up some joint strategy setting sessions or some joint planning sessions where they'd all agreed, the manager and the direct report, that this was the way forward. So very logical, rational reasons for why things might be carried out in the same way. The female line managers, however, were much more balanced and even-handed in their description of how their direct reports might do things differently. And what you found there was that they would be very clear about how both their male and their female direct reports could do things differently from them, and how that might bring opportunity or advantage to the team or to their part of the business or whatever it was. So you've got this much more open-minded attitude around how difference might be a good thing going forward. When we asked about that promotability question, what we also found was we got given some reasons about why or how the direct reports may or may not be ready for promotion from the line managers, and what we tended to find was a difference in the quality of language here. So we heard that the female direct reports were quite often, there were very definitive reasons given as to why they may not be ready for promotion to step into their line manager's role. And the three key themes that came out really clearly around female direct reports not being ready for promotion were either having a generic lack of seniority, which was interesting, given that we found generally those female direct reports were at senior levels anyway, sitting in their roles for longer than their male counterparts, or they were missing a piece of critical technical expertise, or they were not expressing their ambition to step into their line manager's role as actively or as loudly or as clearly as their male peers. When talking about male direct reports, we found that the line managers were less definitive about how ready for promotion their male direct reports were, more caveated, more nuanced, but they were also using slightly different reasons for suggesting they may not be ready, and these reasons tended to congregate around the quality of the male direct report's ability to connect and engage with other people on the team. So it would be around people or team management that the caveats and considerations would be described. So what you're seeing on this slide really are inferences from all of the research that I just described around a majority and a minority mindset. I have put, obviously, men on one side of the slide and women on the other. Doesn't mean that all men answered this way and all women answered that way, but it does suggest that there was a majority mindset and a minority mindset, and some women obviously fall into both those camps, just as some men fall into both those camps. But what we did tend to find was that the majority mindset was all around carrying the culture forward, being fairly unconscious about that, not realizing that there might be any cultural barriers for people who didn't sort of experience the culture in that mainstream way. Seeing consistency as a strength, something that you would want to perpetuate. And interestingly, there was an implicit about how much difference, how much change was appropriate for the organisation, which filtered into this implicit quota or implicit proportionality for minority groups, people who obviously demonstrated difference, even before they opened their mouths and showed their cognitive looked different or behaved differently. Threats, there was a mindset here around what was risky for the organisation and how you might avoid exposing the organisation to too much risk through too much change. And then there was also this very interesting difference in what constituted fairness. That question that was asked early on around how do you get the best out of your direct reports, or how does your manager get the best out of you? Male line managers generally would answer that question with I treat everybody the same, I make sure that I'm fair. And what that implied was really this sense that that was the best way to establish a level playing field, ensuring that equality of treatment. The minority mindset, which generally was tended to be more of the female direct reports and female line managers, they were much more aware and able to talk about how they'd interpreted and navigated their way through a system that had entailed making a few adaptations. They saw difference, as I've already described, as an opportunity to do things differently. It wasn't better or worse. It had advantages and disadvantages, but they could talk about the advantages much more easily. And they were risk alert for the individuals when asked that promotability question, and worried about how the candidate maybe seems inappropriate, or what that might mean in terms of failure if somebody was put into a role where perhaps they weren't likely to succeed. And then the fairness piece was really interesting, because what they talked about was not equality of treatment, but equality of outcomes. And they talked about tailoring and adapting what they did with individuals very specifically so that the individual was given a bit more of a chance. So that implied that they saw the need to level the playing field rather than assuming that equal treatment would provide a level playing field. So last slide, all about the practical so what from a management mindset and from a report mindset. And I suppose these were just the four takeaways that I put together when asked by the school CEO. So, what's the advice you're going to give people on this webinar? First one, really, pretty obvious one. Diversity is not a zero-sum game. Making things better for women or minority group members does not necessitate making them worse for men or the majority group members. What we found quite clearly here was that more women managers suggests you're going to get more likelihood of a management style that is open to diversity, might create a bit more inclusivity, not just for other women, but for everybody, a bit more of that tailoring approach to individuals. There is no need to man up, in inverted commas. There are a lot of stereotypically feminine management behaviours described very positively in this research by men and by women as direct reports that really align, I think, with some of the great research that John Gazema has done. He's published a book called The Athena Doctrine, which describes 21st century leadership behaviours as being more stereotypically female than male. And what came out really clearly, I think, from this research was that some of those behaviours, particularly that empathetic, selfless, passionate, collaborative, sort of expressive style of management was seen very positively. And those management behaviours that involve listening and exploring and connecting and infusing are also experienced as really helpful by direct reports. Manage the team. That last question about what would you do differently from your line manager, I can't remember the exact proportion, but it was very high. All direct reports pretty much said I would spend more time with the team, and I would get the team to work more effectively together. I would help the team really work more effectively at supporting and working with each other's development needs. So that team leadership point suggests that managers are still tending to manage their teams as in small silos or managing individuals as individuals, again representing elements of their team rather than that lateral leadership that's needed sometimes. And then finally, the obvious one, if you're a manager, learning is for life. Not only was the contact between manager and direct report very attenuated at the top of those organisational structures, when asked the question about how does your manager develop you, the answer at the very senior levels was, well, they don't really. I do that for myself. So those very senior direct reports were self-sufficient when it came to personal development, which meant they either had to be, really disciplined around making time and space for their own development, or else, that aspect of learning started to become few and far between in their day-to-day working experiences. So encouraging a growth as opposed to a fixed mindset, I think really important all the way through your career, and not allowing yourself to think, that's it, I've cracked it, I know all there is to know. If your report, little and often, is true around building a really high-quality relationship based on trust and respect, it was avoidance, not argument, challenge, debate, discussion, disagreement that created the low ratings in interviews. It was where there had been very little interaction and people only really saw each other twice a year for very formal reviews, performance or development reviews. And that low score on ease of working really correlated quite closely with some very negative comments about the quality of the management relationship. Talk up difference. I mean, this is sort of a fairly obvious one to me, I think. But particularly if you find yourself in a team where you're all quite similar, encourage some discussion of a broad range of perspectives, suggest somebody plays devil's advocate or brings in some fresh voices into the conversation. Try and broaden people's understanding of the impact they may have if they all, agree too loudly around one or two options. And then finally, if you're a direct report, look forward, don't look up. So think about that 21st century leadership challenge. That means that the leadership that the organisation may need in the medium to longer term may not look like the leadership that it currently has. And I would say here, already we can see that millennials are not modelling their behaviour or their attitudes on the behaviour and attitudes of their baby boomers who sit in, one or two levels above them in the organisation. So all I'm going to say at this point, very happy to take some questions, and I'm going to hand back to Catherine to facilitate that Q&A.
Wow, thank you, Rachel. What a lot of amazing, interesting, fascinating information that we can all digest now. I've seen a couple of questions come through as the presentation was going on, so we'll answer those in just a minute. But as I have the mic, I'm going to ask my own personal question for you, Rachel. So I'm not a current line manager, and so with this information, what can I do with this information when trying to sort of manage up and manage my line manager?
Okay, that's a great question. I would say help your line manager to be as good as they can be as a people manager. And what that means is give them every opportunity through nudges and prompts and those little and often informal interactions to give you feedback in the moment. Encourage them to do that. Take that feedback in a very open and discursive spirit, and give them feedback on something that's been really helpful, actually. So, encourage them through your behaviour to really notice what you're doing and give you advice and regular and frequent feedback on how you're doing, because I think that really comes out loudly and clearly as one of the most useful things that managers can do to help anybody actually that they're managing.
Great, Rachel, thank you. So basically, manage my manager on how to manage me.
Exactly.
Excellent. Now, if we reverse these roles, a question that's come through of a line manager is, what does this mean a line manager should be aware of or looking out for?
Okay. So again, this is much easier for me to say than for me to do, and I have managed teams across geographies and know how tricky it can be when you have got a very diverse team operating in different parts of the globe and in different cultural backgrounds. But I would say if you're a line manager, what you should really be looking out for are two things. And I'm going to balance out what we heard from the male line managers with what we heard from the female line managers here. So if you're operating with that mindset of equal treatment for all, then I would ask you to really examine how equal that treatment is. What we found was, even though those male line managers predominantly said, I treat everybody the same, when we explored, it actually said they did around the development management piece, they didn't treat everybody the same. What they really did was they spent more time with some people, they were more open to informal interactions with some people, and they were giving slightly different advice to some people than others. And that was broadly based on how close they were, how that geographically and in a sort of psychological sense, but also how similar they felt people were to them and therefore more likely to succeed. So I would say if you're a line manager, think about whether you really, really are treating people as equally as you think. And then to take the best from what we heard from some of those female line managers, best way of knowing whether you're doing that is by asking the people you're managing if there's anything else you could do that would really help them. And what we found here was that quite often the direct reports had very clear ideas about what their line managers could be doing to help them not only perform better, get the best out of them, but develop and help them with those promotability visualizations. So I would say take the best of both gendered findings from this research. Ask your direct reports very frequently what you can do that's really working for them and what you could do to give them more of what really works for them, and just examine how fair and consistent you really are. We found quite a lot of direct reports felt neglected, overlooked, squeezed out of their managers' diaries, and really that their development was not a high priority for their line manager. So that would be one other thing that you could think about, how you can really demonstrate that development is important for all.
So trying to be fair to all, but also fighting your unconscious bias. Absolutely. That I suspect we all suffer from, exactly. So taking that one step further, since we're talking specifically about women in the workplace, what are certain managers doing that are helping women specifically?
Yeah. This is quite a tricky one to answer with a degree of rigor because it's different things for different people. I'm going to just split my response into more junior women and more senior women, if that's okay. So I'd say at the bottom end of that career hierarchy, and I know it's never completely linear, but let's just oversimplify for the sake of this response. For junior female direct reports, then I would say just make sure that they're getting a real breadth of experience, make sure that they're getting exposure and profile at that early level. What we tend to find for those junior women is they are not expressing their ambition over the medium to long term. They're not saying they want to be CEO or make it to Exco. They're really looking at the next 1 or 2 steps up, and that is quite appropriate from that stage. For all the reasons that have been shown in all the other research out there about why women don't make it through an executive pipeline, they're already anticipating some of the life events that may knock them sideways when it comes to career building. So encourage your junior female talent to really broaden and form a solid basis for building, I would say, a platformed career with that solid, broad base. More senior levels, I'd say if you've got some senior female talent and they're not progressing as quickly as the male talent, then I think it's time to have a really long, hard look at what it's going to take to rebrand and reposition them as it's somebody who requires either a promotion or quite a big intervention when it comes to their career boosting activity. And here, I'd say it's really important to make sure that senior female talent is not putting up and shutting up. What we heard quite clearly is that senior male talent tends to be agitating and looking for a move, looking for promotion, looking for something new and exciting to do, and the female talent wasn't being quite vocal around that. So I think the point here is with your senior female talent, you might need to listen much more carefully to what they're really saying and interpret it with a slightly gendered lens around what does that really mean if I look at what they're doing versus what they're saying. Because we found quite often those senior female leaders, even though they were direct reports to even more senior men and women, were operating with this mindset of spending a lot of time with their direct reports and their team to make sure that not only were people performing well, but they were really engaged in what they were doing. So you may well find some subtle differences in your employee opinion or engagement scores too, which might reinforce your view around what those female leaders, female direct reports at the top levels are doing.
Very interesting. Thank you. Now, on the line, apart from line managers and those of us scrambling up the corporate ladder, we also have some representatives from HR, and one of them has asked how they should be advising their line managers to behave.
Well, that's a $64 million question. And as I don't know the full variety of organizations and cultures and processes and training programs you have in place for all your line managers, I'm going to give you a slightly cop-out answer, but it's a genuinely heartfelt one. I would say take the questions that we use for this research, 7 very short, sharp, easy questions, and start to pick a few management trios in your own organisation and ask the questions and see what you get back. I think you'll find quite quickly you get some really interesting findings coming back. The last question we asked, which isn't reported here, was at the very end, the wrap-up question at the end of the interview, was there anything else you'd like to add? And what we found quite often was that having answered really intuitively and free form, a lot of managers said, wow, I've just been hearing myself and I've just been thinking about what I've been saying, and I need to go away and have a think about this. So I think just by asking the questions, you prompt some change and reflection of your line managers. So that's a really simple intervention that anybody can do at any point. And if you want something more complex, then I would say, get out there and find out exactly what your line managers are doing, their intention behind that is being mistranslated, misinterpreted, and misunderstood by the direct reports, and vice versa. Because I think if you can close that gap, that management gap, then I think you will be already identifying some really useful interventions in your organisation.
Great, thank you. We don't have too much time left, Rachel, but I got one last question for you, and it has to do with stereotypes. If we look at the information you presented to us today, how do you find these findings? Do these findings reflect reality, or are they simply perceptions that are influenced by gender stereotypes?
Okay. So, great question. And as a psychologist, all of our perceptions are influenced by gender stereotypes. We'd be an amazing sort of creature if we grew up in a social world such as we do and we weren't influenced by gender stereotypes. Do they reflect reality? I think we've done enough on the statistical side to demonstrate that, yes, they are statistically significant differences with a sufficient degree of confidence, and I'm using that as a statistical term, to show there are some differences in the way that people are behaving or experiencing the behaviour of others in their organisation. I mean, it's always a good idea to be aware of those gender stereotypes and to question yourself around them. I think it's very hard to banish them entirely from your consciousness, but hopefully some of the practical recommendations that we've made in this research will help you to manage some of the unintended consequences possibly arising from those stereotypes.
Great, thank you. And as I mentioned, this is all the time we have with Rachel today. But if you have any more questions, do feel free to contact Rachel. She has very kindly offered to follow up with any individuals regarding your queries offline. So you'll see in front of you her email address, and we'll also share this in a follow-up email after the call. To just continue on, School for CEOs are absolute keen supporters of Rachel and the 30% Club. And we're going to be running an all-female 24-hour runway program to really help support Rachel 30% Club and this whole initiative. So the program's going to be run on the 15th of June this year, so not too far away, with a dinner on the 14th to kick it all off. And we've got quite a number of amazing practitioners that will be joining us, so do get in touch if you'd like to have more information. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you once more, Rachel, for such a wonderful experience and for sharing your time with us with all these fascinating insights. Again, everyone, thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.
Bye.